Imagine you wake up on Christmas morning and 5 of your children are gone. Not because of a custody dispute. Not because they ran away. Not because of illness. They are gone because, in the early hours of Christmas Day 1945, your house burned to the ground while you slept, and when the flames finally surrendered to the December cold, you searched the ash for your children and found nothing. No bones. No teeth. No trace of 5 human beings who had been alive just hours before. That is the story the official record tells, and for nearly 80 years, it has refused to hold together. Fayetteville, West Virginia, in 1945, was the kind of small American town that barely registered on a national map. Tucked into the Appalachian foothills, it was a place shaped by coal, by hard labor, and by the particular kind of community that forms when people share hardship across generations. The war had just ended. Men were coming home. The country was exhaling after years of fear, rationing, and loss. George Sodder had lived in Fayetteville for decades. He had come from Tolla, Italy, as a young immigrant, built a modest but stable life, married a woman named Jennie, and together they had raised 10 children in a 2-story house on a rural property outside town. George ran a trucking business. He was known as opinionated, direct, and occasionally combative, qualities that would become relevant in ways he could not yet imagine. By December of 1945, George and Jennie's household was full of life. Their 10 children ranged from infants to young adults. On Christmas Eve, the 5 youngest still at home that night were Maurice, 14 years old, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie, 8, and Betty, 5. The older children, some already moved out, some working, were not present when the fire began. That evening, Christmas Eve, the house was warm with the particular energy of a family anticipating the next morning. The children had decorated a tree. George had recently installed a second-hand telephone. The family had gone to bed at different times through the night, the younger children staying up later than usual with holiday excitement. Jennie Sodder would later describe receiving a strange phone call that night. A woman she did not recognize called and asked for someone by a name that meant nothing to Jennie, then laughed in a way that Jennie found deeply unsettling before hanging up. Jennie noted that the woman sounded as if she were in a crowded place, glasses clinking in the background, as though calling from a restaurant or bar. It was an odd call. She pushed it to the back of her mind and went to bed. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, a fire began. Jennie was woken by the smell of smoke. The house was already filling. She woke her husband and several of the older children still in the house, and they escaped into the December cold. George tried to go back inside. He tried multiple times. He would later describe the desperation of those attempts, clawing toward the stairs, driven back by heat and smoke, unable to reach the second floor where Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty were sleeping. He ran to a ladder he kept propped against the side of the house to reach the second-floor window. The ladder was not there. He tried to climb the exterior walls. He could not get purchase. He ran to his truck, intending to drive it close enough to use as a platform to reach the upper windows. The truck would not start, despite having run without issue the day before. The house burned. Within 45 minutes, it was almost entirely gone. No fire department arrived for several hours. The children did not come out. In the morning, when the ashes had cooled enough to search, George and Jennie looked for their children. What they found, or rather what they did not find, became the central wound of the rest of their lives. There were no remains. In a typical fatal house fire, the human body is devastatingly resilient to total destruction. Even in the most intense residential blazes, investigators routinely recover bones, teeth, and other biological material. Cremation, the deliberate and sustained application of extreme heat to a human body in a purpose-built chamber, requires temperatures above 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit maintained for 2 or more hours to reduce a body to ash and small bone fragments. A residential house fire, burning wooden construction, does not reach those temperatures. It does not maintain them uniformly. 5 children should have left recoverable evidence. None was found. The official local investigation moved quickly and concluded simply. The children had perished in the fire, and the remains had been completely consumed. The case was closed without extensive forensic examination of the site. A local contractor hired to clear the debris reportedly found what was described as a liver in the ruins, which some accounts suggest was either dismissed or never conclusively examined. The precise chain of evidence, who examined it, what conclusion was drawn, and by whom, has never been fully documented. The Fayetteville fire marshal ruled the fire accidental, attributing it to faulty wiring. George Sodder hired his own investigator. He did not accept the official conclusion. He could not. In the weeks and months that followed, details emerged that made the closed case feel increasingly porous. The family's ladder had been found after the fire at the bottom of a nearby embankment, away from where George remembered leaving it. The telephone line, George discovered, had not burned through in the fire as one might expect. It had been cut. Investigators would later note that the line appeared to have been severed cleanly before the fire began. Telephone lines running along the exterior of a house do not typically survive a major fire intact while being cut at a precise point. That detail was never satisfactorily explained. The fact that George's truck refused to start that night carried its own weight. Here was a working vehicle, maintained by a man whose livelihood depended on operational equipment, which chose the precise night of the fire to malfunction. After the fire, the truck started without difficulty. Local witnesses came forward with accounts that should not have existed if the children died in the blaze. Several people reported seeing a car slow near the Sodder property in the hours before the fire, and at least one witness claimed to have seen a man removing something from the house's fuse box, the same fuse box that would later be found intact in the rubble despite the fire's supposed electrical origin. At least one motorist claimed to have driven past the burning house and seen faces at the upper windows. No one called for help. More troubling still were the sightings that came after. In the days following the fire, multiple witnesses, some known to the Sodder family, some strangers, reported seeing children matching the descriptions of the missing 5. A woman at a hotel in Bluefield, West Virginia, claimed to have seen several children in the company of 2 adults, one Italian-speaking man and a woman, passing through the lobby the morning after the fire. When she tried to interact with the children, the adults moved them quickly away. She described the children as appearing frightened. She did not know who the Sodders were when she saw them. She only made the connection weeks later, when she saw a missing persons notice. Similar accounts came from other locations. A woman in Charleston reported seeing children matching the descriptions. None of these sightings were thoroughly investigated at the time. Law enforcement in Fayetteville did not pursue the accounts with urgency. No serious missing persons investigation was opened for the children, because the official conclusion remained that they had perished in the fire. George and Jennie Sodder did not stop. They erected a billboard along a nearby highway, a large, weather-beaten sign with photographs of the 5 missing children and a plea for information. The sign stood for years, a monument to refusal, to the particular stubbornness of parents who could not allow the world to simply close a file. George and Jennie spent money from the trucking business. They hired private investigators. They pursued every lead, however thin. They contacted state officials, federal officials, journalists. They did not get far. There are historical accounts suggesting that George Sodder had made enemies before the fire. In the preceding years, he had been publicly critical of Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator who had dominated Italy during the war. In the heavily Italian-American communities of West Virginia, This was not a politically neutral position. George had argued with other Italian Americans who were more sympathetic to the fascist government. On at least one occasion, according to accounts that have circulated in investigations of the case, a man who had come to the Sodder property on business made a comment that was remembered afterward as troubling, something to the effect that George's house would burn and his children would be destroyed. George did not take the statement seriously at the time. He had heard strong words before. Whether that exchange was connected to what happened on Christmas Eve, 1945, nobody has ever established. Then, in 1967, 22 years after the fire, something arrived that shattered whatever fragile equilibrium George and Jennie had managed to construct. A letter came to Jennie Sodder. Inside was a photograph. The photograph showed a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair and a particular bone structure around the eyes and jaw that Jennie Sodder recognized immediately. She believed, with a certainty she carried for the rest of her life, that the man in the photograph was her son Louis, who would have been in his early 30s by 1967. On the back of the photograph, in an unidentified hand, were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Illil boys." A 90132 or 35. The sender was never identified. The handwriting was never matched. The photograph's origin was never established. Jennie Sodder showed the photograph to people who had known Louis as a child. Some agreed the resemblance was striking. Others were less certain. The photograph was never examined using any forensic comparison method that could establish a definitive conclusion. What it offered instead was something perhaps more punishing than certainty. The possibility that Louis Sodder was alive. The possibility that at least one of the 5 children had survived. The possibility that for 22 years, the official record had been wrong. Not mistaken, but wrong. George Sodder died in 1969, 2 years after the photograph arrived, still without an answer. He reportedly asked that his body be buried without a memorial until the mystery of his children was resolved. The mystery was not resolved. Jennie continued the search until her own death in 1989. The billboard stood until 1989, when she finally agreed to take it down. The theories that have accumulated around this case are numerous, and they differ widely in the degree of evidence supporting them. The most straightforward explanation, that the children died in the fire and the absence of remains was the result of unusual combustion conditions or inadequate initial investigation, cannot be entirely dismissed. Fires behave unpredictably. Early 1940s rural fire investigations were not conducted with the rigor or forensic tools available decades later. It is possible, if not easily explainable, that remains could have been missed. But the accumulation of anomalies resists a simple accidental explanation. Ladders do not relocate themselves. Telephone lines do not cut cleanly on their own. Trucks do not fail for one night and one night only. Multiple unconnected witnesses do not independently fabricate sightings of specific children in specific locations. Letters containing photographs of specific people do not arrive anonymously without some prior knowledge of their existence. The abduction theory, that the children were taken during or immediately before the fire, possibly by parties connected to George Sodder's political adversaries, or through organized crime networks that operated in parts of the Italian-American community during that era, has been advanced by investigators, journalists, and family members over the decades. It explains the absence of remains. It explains the cut telephone line. It explains some of the witness sightings. It is compatible with the photograph. It does not explain why 5 children were taken, where they were taken, or why, in 70+ years, not one of them or their descendants has come forward publicly with a clear account. The possibility that organized criminal activity connected to Mussolini-era Italian political networks played a role, given George's outspoken anti-fascist views and the pre-fire threat, has been seriously discussed by researchers of the case. In the mid-1940s, Italian-American organized crime networks were real, established, and capable of coordinated action. Whether such networks would have targeted a family in rural West Virginia over political disagreements remains speculative. The connection exists as a theory, not a fact. What is not theoretical is the suffering. George Sodder spent the rest of his working life driving trucks and paying private investigators. Jennie Sodder spent 44 years after the fire in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn fully, because mourning requires knowing. The children who survived, who grew up with the absence of 5 siblings, have spoken over the years of the way uncertainty shaped their family. Normal grief has a shape. It has a beginning and, eventually, a kind of resting place. What the Sodder family experienced was something else. A wound that could not close because it could not be fully understood. There is a particular cruelty in unresolved loss. Confirmed death, however devastating, offers the living a path forward. The body exists. The fact is fixed. But when someone simply vanishes, when the official answer is undermined by evidence that refuses to go away, the mind cannot settle. Every year that passes becomes a year in which the missing person may still be alive. Every year is also a year in which they did not call, did not write, did not return. And so hope and grief exist simultaneously, each preventing the other from completing its work. Jennie Sodder kept the photograph of the young man she believed was Lewis in her home until she died. She never found out who sent it or why. She never received confirmation that the man in the image was her son. She died not knowing. The Sodder case has been examined by journalists, documentary filmmakers, amateur investigators, and true crime researchers for decades. A number of investigators have called for a formal reopening of the case, for forensic examination of the property site, and for modern analysis of the 1967 photograph. Some of these efforts have made progress. None have reached a conclusion. The Fayetteville fire marshal's ruling of accidental death remains the official record. 5 children. A Christmas Eve fire. A missing ladder, a cut phone line, a truck that wouldn't start, dozens of witness sightings, and a photograph that arrived 22 years too late to offer anything but more questions. What is perhaps most disturbing about the Sodder case is not the mystery itself, though the mystery is genuine and documented. What is most disturbing is how easily it was closed. How a fire in a small West Virginia town in 1945 could consume 5 children, or not consume them, and the official record could be completed in weeks. The case filed, the family left to pursue the truth with their own money for the rest of their lives. George Sodder died believing his children had been taken from him. Jennie Sodder died the same way. They were not fringe figures or conspiracy theorists. They were parents who looked in the ashes for their children and found nothing, and who spent the rest of their lives asking a question that nobody in authority was willing to seriously pursue. If 5 children burned in this house, where are the bones? That question has never received a satisfactory answer. The billboard is gone. George and Jennie are gone. The 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, would be in their 80s and 90s now if they lived. The house on the rural property outside Fayetteville is long gone. What remains is the question. A cut telephone wire. A photograph. A mother's certainty that the face in an anonymous image belonged to her son. And the stubborn, unresolved fact that sits at the center of everything, unchanged after nearly 80 years. Nobody knows what happened to the 5 Sodder children on Christmas Eve, 1945, and nobody can prove they died.